Rubenstein. I'm also one of the organizers for the fall seminar series. We're really excited about this. I think this is the first of what hopefully will be many graduate 5-minute thesis competition. This is based off of the internationally known 3-minute thesis competition. We decided to give you an extra 2 minutes just because I personally wanted to hear all about your research, just that extra 2 minutes. Just a few things to talk about. First, I'd like to introduce our judges and thank them for their time. Kimberly Wallen. Kimberly is a research associate professor and associate dean of research and graduate programs here in Rubenstein. We've got Kunal Palawat, who's a senior undergraduate in UVM in a major in environmental sciences. And then Chris Stepanek, extension assistant professor of watershed science, policy, and education. So thank you to our judges. We really appreciate that. I also want to extend a thank you to Hannah, who is my co-organizer for this. She's done the lion's share of the work for this 5-minute thesis competition, so thank you for that. She's also competing today, so it's a little bit biased. I kid. So the format for today, obviously, it's a 5-minute presentation. I will introduce all of the presenters. They'll have 5 minutes to give their pitch. Please save your questions until the end. We'll have a little bit of an open soiree at the end where you can ask questions that will be moderated and you can clean up all the food. So there'll be a rapid turnaround time. So presenters, please be ready for your turn. I'll also be timekeeping. For presenters, I will be giving you a 3-minute and then a 1-minute warning, and then giving you a hard stop time. Judging will be based upon a rubric. Really, the overarching criteria is that this is clearly and concisely conveyed research. We do have select items, the ability to present within that time limit, the use of visual aids, a general overview of the research. Does that research reach a diverse audience? The relevance of that research, and also just the creativity element. So our judges will be scoring that. In the event of a tie, our judges will be making an on-the-top decision about who resonated. And lastly, I want to thank RGSA for the cash prizes. First place will be awarded $50, second place $25, and third place $10. So that's most of what I have to say before we get things started, but I want to ask Alyssa to come up.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Shute, and I just wanted to bring your attention. I'm really excited that there's so many participants in this, and it's a great way to practice communication skills. And I wanted to bring your attention to practicing your writing communication skills. There is, I don't know if you are aware, but there's Eco News Vermont, and we put out about a quarterly email and with sort of science translation digests of research happening in Vermont. And we would love for any of you to submit your 500-word digest. You can talk to me. I'm in 303I, just down the hall. You can send an email. And Camille Marcotte is working with me this year, so you can reach out to her as well. So feel free to send me something or ask questions.
Thanks, Alyssa. All right, so we'll get things started. I'd like to welcome Jen Santoro. We'll be talking about impacts and replacing wind and salvage logging on hemlock hardwood forests in southern New England. Jen,
all right. Well, thank you, Pete. So we all know the story of. I guess I should change the slide. Okay. Does this not work? The mouse doesn't work. Okay. Anyway, so we all know the story of a Kansas girl named Dorothy who was swept up by a tornado and transported to the wonderful, magical land of Oz. And unfortunately, tornadoes don't work like that in real life. We wish. But these rapidly rotating columns of wind do more than just kill wicked witches and terrorize Midwest states. They're actually really important ecologically, and believe it or not, New England does experience tornadoes. They're rare, but they happen. On June 1st, 2011, South Central Massachusetts experienced one of these tornadoes. It was one of the most severe wind disturbances to occur in the Northeast. This tornado left a 63-kilometer wide swath of dead trees, toppled buildings, and just general destruction. You could even see it on the NASA satellite images. The forest, however, is growing back, so this isn't all bad. So let's step back for a moment and consider what wind disturbance actually does to a forest. Hurricanes and tornadoes are agents of change. They're not always bad, as the word disturbance might imply. They actually can promote long-term forest health. This is a good thing. So when these severe wind events are few and far between, the forest has time to recover in the interim. So it can come back to this pre-disturbance state after, of course, many years, because trees grow very slowly. These resilient forests can eventually return to the state that they were at before the disturbance. We can think of this as catching the flu. It's that time of year. You might lose your voice, you might feel pretty crummy for a while, you might be operating at half capacity, but eventually, after a few weeks, you recover, and life goes on as normal. The flu doesn't tend to alter your general trajectory of life, at least I hope not. However, there are other things that can alter the trajectory of a forest, and one of these is human disturbance. Today I'm going to talk about salvage logging. This is a process that's common after disturbances like these, and it involves removing the fallen trees, such as these, from the landscape. There are many reasons for this. Reducing fire risk, safety, aesthetics are some. But without adequate time to recover, this double blow of disturbances, first a tornado and then human-induced salvage logging, could potentially affect the future trajectory of that forest recovery. Let's think of this like catching the flu and then hurting your back. If you don't take care of yourself, you could eventually recover, but you could mess up your back permanently, and that might alter your trajectory of life. No more climbing camels. So the question today, moving back to trees, is will this forest bounce back after a compound disturbance of tornado and salvage logging? And or will the future forest structure and composition after this compound disturbance be permanently changed? So I'm going to look at this from the point of regeneration. After all, these are the little baby trees that are going to become big adult trees in the future and determine what we have in our forests. My research looks at the impacts of tornado damage and salvage logging on forest regeneration diversity. So diversity is a pretty good measure of what we're going to see in the future. And I'll illustrate this with an example. If we've got a carpet of white pine seedlings covering the ground, we can be expected to get white pine back. But if we have a diverse carpet of seedlings on the forest floor, each different type of species has a better chance at surviving. So it's likely we'll get a more diverse forest. And more diverse forests promote greater ecosystem services and greater habitat for wildlife, among a few things. So my results show that in the tornado damage plots indicated in orange, there is really high regeneration diversity. So this might indicate the forest is responding and transitioning back to its original state. However, in the green plots, which were the salvage logged plots, there's really low diversity. This might indicate that salvage logging is homogenizing the forest composition and that the forest may not actually return to its original state down the road. So this might actually significantly alter the trajectory of forest composition and change. So to wrap up, this is the age of the internet, and I can describe my work in 5 emojis. Tornadoes and salvage logging, compound disturbance, impacts forests, and in this particular case, the salvage logging operations may have been intense enough to permanently alter forest change going forward. What will this mean for habitat? What will this mean for forest management? How will climate change play into this? So many questions. So, Toto, I've got a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. Thank you.
There's a couple seats up here if people want to kind of squeeze in. It's okay, we don't bite.
Okay, our next presenter, Kenna Newcastle. Reindeer grazing and ecosystem function, the case of an island in Warrior Street.
Hi everyone, I am Kenna Newcastle. I'm a first year Ph.D. student at Rubenstein, and I'm going to be telling you a story today about reindeer, climate change, soil microbes, and the Sami indigenous people. And this is work I did last year in a Fulbright project. So the Sami indigenous people down here on the left manage semi-domesticated reindeer herds in all of northern Finlandia. And these reindeer eat in the winter lichen. They actually can smell the lichen through the snow. It's a very important food source. But lichen is very sensitive to changes in climate. So these lichen cannot grow, they cannot reproduce if they are dry. And so you might think that with climate change, the abundance of lichen and the range of lichen is going to be changing, and the reindeer herds are going to be kind of tracking those changes. The reindeer are going to be introduced into ecosystems where they have not previously been grazing because of climate change. And so my question is, what kind of impacts happen for ecosystem function at the very onset of grazing? When reindeer are first introduced to a system, can we see changes in things like microbial diversity, microbial community composition, and the function of these microbes? And these are the soil microbes that are very important for big ecosystem processes like decomposition, nutrient cycle, and things like that. So this takes me to my case study, this island called Holmlund, and it's off the coast of Boreal Sweden. There's about a few miles separating the island from the mainland, but during the winter, sea ice actually connects the two, so reindeer can naturally access the island. But for the past 70 years, the moose hunters have excluded the reindeer from the island. So this is kind of a reindeer have been absent for this island for a very long time, but this past winter, before I did my research, the Sami had been given permission for the first time in decades to allow reindeer to access the island. So you have this island system where reindeer are now being introduced, and they're grazing these lichen for the first time. So to get at this question of how the microbes are impacted by this, I set up this randomized block design where on the island I had 4 sites. Each site has a grazed plot and an ungrazed plot. And I took soil from these plots and put them in jars in the lab to incubate them. So you have a soil from a ungrazed plot, soil from a grazed plot, and I added these different types of leaf litter. So these are leaves that are abundant on the island, and they represent different nutritional things for the microbes. Aspen leaves are yummier than lichen litter is. And then I incubated these soils for 60 days and tracked all kinds of things like microbial function and microbial community dynamics. And so you might ask, why litter? So it makes sense that I'm collecting soil from grazed and ungrazed plots, but what is this litter component getting at? It's because reindeer grazing impacts the soil physical property, which is like the microbial habitat. It affects where the microbes live. But it also impacts what they eat. And this is kind of the long-term idea. If the reindeer are eating the lichen, the microbes cannot eat the lichen. And so this is both of these factors affect microbial community and microbial function. So this first graph here gets at that functional part. So this is a graph of decomposition, and this is over the course of my 60-day incubation. The colors correspond to the different type of litter I added, and the dashed versus solid lines are the grazing treatment. And what I really want you to get from this graph is that there's clumping along this grazing treatment. So you can see that even after one winter of grazing, that you get kind of a decrease in these microbes' ability to decompose litter, and that's regardless of litter type. The second piece, kind of getting at the more microbial community dynamic, is comparing the dominance of bacteria and the growth of bacteria versus fungi, these very important soil microbes over time. So here, you're not seeing that clumping according to the grazing treatment. So maybe grazing doesn't really impact who's doing what, but you see this transition over time of who's dominating. So first you have these bacteria really strongly growing early in the incubation, and then they kind of die off, but you get this uptick in fungal growth. And this doesn't change with grazing, and it doesn't change with litter type. This is just kind of getting at what these microbes are good at. Bacteria colonize really quickly, eat all the yummy stuff. The fungi come in and clean up what's left and grow more slowly. And so the take-home message from here is, after one winter of grazing, when reindeer are freshly introduced, you see this impact in the function of the microbes. maybe not so much in the community, but there's still some kind of functional signal there that's really important. And this kind of maybe complicates this relationship between, do we allow the Sami to graze their reindeer in new lands or not? Thank you.
Up next, we have Bess Perry, talking National Park Service relevance and urban resilience.
The National Park Service strives to embody our nation's democratic ideals. It conserves spaces and stories of our collective identity and our scenery across the country. However, the Park Service has a problem. Although they conserve these spaces for all, they're not enjoyed by all. So the Park Service, like other conservation agencies and community collaboratives, has worked to build relevance, worked to make strong connections to these underrepresented groups. One of these efforts is the Park Service's urban agenda. 80% of Americans and 40% of the Park Service portfolio are in cities. So these are prime places to connect parks with large, proximate, and diverse populations. Their urban agenda is centered on 3 goals: relevance for all Americans, building a culture of collaboration externally, and building a culture of collaboration internally, what they're calling 1NPS. They piloted it in 10 cities across the US, and I helped the Park Service identify strategic areas to focus limited resources for maximum impact in building relevance. I looked in Boston, Tucson, and Detroit using a program of mixed methods research. Qualitative, in-depth interviews with Park Service personnel and community partners, and a broader quantitative social network analysis with those interviewees and more participants. I also plucked out Park Service perspectives from each of those methods. So, what is relevance? Well, relevance is perceived differently. The Park Service perceives it as targeting sub-communities, racial and ethnic minorities, and youth in particular, and focusing the goal on an agency level, building Park Service diversity in their visitation, workforce, and sites and stories. However, community partners broadened out this level, thinking beyond just the agency, targeting all Americans, the whole local community, and building out the goal to be livable cities and communities, in particular, stable systems and infrastructure, functioning biophysical processes, and a strong identity of place, that the Park Service could work towards all of these beyond agency goals. And I argue, yes, these could be complementary as long as the Park Service embeds itself into these larger goal systems. So who are the brokers of relevance? Who are these middle agents doing the facilitation of connections and making that creative batter to reach more Americans in more creative ways? Well, this is Tucson, but all 3 cities look similar. And in present networks, we find that the central players are the usual suspects: outdoor recreation organizations and sustainability organizations. However, when I asked about who has potential to step into their power and take on more of a brokerage role to reach out to more of these communities, we found that the picture changes a little bit. It's the organizations on the fringes of the network, and also some who are central players currently, but have enthusiasm for more growth. These tend to be health, cultural resources, and diversity organizations. Now, of course, we want a redundancy of effort. We don't want each of these categories represented by only one organization. So the Park Service needs to work on building relationships with multiple players in each of these types. Internally, I asked, where's internal Park Service relevance? Who finds it relevant to speak to whom? Well, the Park Service, like many federal bureaucracies, is highly structured. In the case of parks, one participant noted this, saying, there isn't one NPS. There's 380 NPSs, and then that gets multiplied at the park level, you end up with 10,000 NPSs. Despite this structure separating park units, I did find that communication between parks is greatest. And offices and programs which don't have a land base in the Park Service, it tends to be less. However, programs are these creative fringes. They work exclusively in communities beyond park boundaries and can potentially be the tentacles to create this relevance. People wanted to connect with programs in depth. And one participant colorfully stated, programs are effective, but they could be doing a hell of a lot more damage in all the positive and right ways if we can navigate this structure. So how can the Park Service contribute to cityscape resilience? 3 ways. Recognizing cityscape goals, facilitating this diverse brokerage, and strengthening cross-Park Service relationships in order to be able to mobilize and capitalize on situations of opportunity and respond to threats. In this way, collaboration is a pathway to relevance, not an equal goal, and relevance can be conceptualized on different layers. In this way, the Park Service can work to continuously strive for relevance and for resilience by including diversity, redundancy, and creativity in its efforts. Thank you.
Okay, up next we have Hillary Byerly, WWTD, Application of Behavioral Economics to Conservation. Thank you.
Okay, so WWTD. What would Thaler do? Richard Thaler, just won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in establishing the field of behavioral economics. Thaler's trained as an economist, but early in his career he observed that people didn't really follow these assumptions of economics that most people make rational choices, that we have perfect information, and we can compute complex problems in our mind. What Thaler really found was that we don't make rational choices often. One such example might be using one slide to put up a photo screen for. But really horror movies are a good example of this dimension of human behavior. So while Courtney Cox was approaching this spooky barn at night alone, there's a serial killer on the loose, rationally she might have chosen not to go inside. But she did. It's common problem in scary movies. But while most of us won't be faced with that kind of problem, this barn can represent other kinds of threats, like chronic disease from too much bacon and Netflix, or not saving enough for retirement, or climate change and biodiversity loss. So, thanks everyone for coming back. Finale. But really, we don't make rational choices often, economically rational choices, and this really matters because a lot of our public policies or environmental policies and programs are built on these models and these assumptions that we do. So a quick little brief insight to some dimensions of behavioral economics, which it kind of brings psychological realism to the field of economics. So one, we're biased, not in sort of the socially prejudiced way you might think, but more in that we make consistent errors in how we evaluate information and assess probabilities. We care about others. This is sort of a no-duh, but a lot of economics is built on this idea of pure self-interest. But in fact, really we care about what other people think, their perceptions of us, their behaviors, and also about the impacts of our actions on them. And then we can be nudged. So a nudge is sort of this way to influence decisions by leveraging these sort of supposedly irrelevant factors of a decision. So how information is framed or who delivers information, those things have been shown to matter. So these and other insights, applications of them, have actually helped people save more for retirement, make healthier decisions, donate more to charity, but the evidence on what they can do to address environmental challenges is much thinner. So this is kind of the motivating question for my dissertation. Can we use these more realistic insights about human behavior to build better models about decision making for the environment, and can that produce sort of more effective conservation policies and programs? And so I'm going to ask that question. I have sort of three chapters, no results yet, but first, can nudges influence decisions that impact the environment? So this is actually a review that I conducted with some colleagues, and we looked at experimental evidence to see if we can influence choices people make about transportation, water use, meat consumption, And we find that, that social norms, information about social norms seems to matter, and also making it easy for people to act for environmentally. There are a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and especially around how people manage land and natural resources. So that sort of motivates the second question. Does social context matter to landowners? So what we're hoping to do is conduct a field experiment here in New England with forest landowners and test whether public recognition might be a more effective way to promote wildlife conservation than financial incentives. And the idea here is that if landowners care about what their neighbors think, and they also care about the impacts that their decisions might have on society, that might be more motivating than putting a price on biodiversity. And then this third question is, do we see the presence of some of these well-documented biases in conservation priorities? So here we're hoping to run an experiment at a big conference with people who are interested in conservation, many of whom are working in conservation. And we're going to test whether these participants are more likely to fund conservation that is geared towards protection, so preventing losses, or restoration, so gains in conservation. And then also, we're going to see whether it matters if those efforts are gained at a specific, probably furry species, or at a maybe more general, but maybe more important ecosystem. So hopefully we'll extrapolate findings from these studies out to see what those effects how those effects might play out on the landscape, and ideally make some gains and inroads to building the evidence base on this question, and to see whether we can use behavioral economics to advance conservation. Thank you.
Up next we have Tracy McGowan, carbon tax for our cap and trade, the policy options for climate change mitigation. Sorry for messing with that.
That's all right. Hi, and thank you so much for doing this. It's great to share research. So the question being, oh, it's not supposed to be there. Yeah. No, this is wrong. Oh, well. Yeah, this is wrong.
This is the slides that you sent me.
I sent you 3 slides. This is my entire dissertation.
All right.
All right, so what I'll do is, essentially, the question is, when it comes to mitigation for climate change strategies, is that the 2 options are applying a carbon tax or using, I've seen this, trying a carbon tax or doing cap and trade. So right now we have relatively 42 initiatives on carbon pricing around the world. Most of them are cap and trade or carbon tax. What's happening in Europe now, which is interesting, is that you're beginning to see a mixture of both. This is where the cutting edge is. Like right now in America, we've got RGGI here in the Northeast, and California, which is cap and trade, which includes Ontario and Quebec, and that accounts for roughly 25% of the US economy. So, all right. So the reason why you want to prevent, in a cap and trade system, you want to prevent this from happening. What happened was that in 2005, they started the emissions trading system in Europe at $15. Within 18 months, it had dropped up to 30, so you've got inflationary pressures. And then you get collapse because they eventually realize there's too much supply in the market. And then you get a spike and another collapse, and the market has never recovered. So these are the things that you need to really account for, is you need to account for your floor price and your ceiling price. So we are in this low price situation, and what happened in this issue here is that the utility companies never changed their pricing structure. So they have been gouging because they are still pricing it as if it was $30 euros a ton. Okay, now, because the slide isn't there, I'm going to have to do it off the top of my head. So British Columbia has a carbon tax at 30 Canadian dollars per ton. That is the most successful one, but it also demonstrates the strengths and weaknesses of doing a carbon tax. Carbon tax problems are that it is difficult to get the cap right. You have to be able to get the tax price right without impacting the economy, but institute behavioral change anyways. And once it's in place, the other problem with it is that it's rigid. The good news is it's easy to implement. Politically, it's difficult to implement unless you make it revenue neutral, which is what British Columbia did. The problem with that is that it doesn't raise revenue. So in in California, the last auction was roughly $15 US to $19 Canadian per ton. And that is higher, but it's way below what Stern says is necessary, which is in the range between $68 a ton and $170 a ton. So in Reggie, it's about $470 a ton. So this is essentially what we're dealing with. In the cap and trade system, easy to politically implement it. It's economically efficient in the sense that companies choose whether or not to mitigate and reduce their emissions through operations, or to purchase the right to pollute and do more. And so that is the benefit of the cap and trade system. The problem is in the cap and trade is that you want to avoid the inflationary measures point. And the only way that you can really prevent that inflationary price spike happening is to have a reserve. And the reserve is that you have an excess supply which you tighten the market with by purchasing. You need a central controller for that. So essentially treating carbon as a currency, you're purchasing the permits and then selling them back into the market when the price gets so high. So the takeaway point on this is that you technically need both. You need a carbon tax to manage the floor price, and you need a cap and trade system to manage the system. So Europe at the moment is the only one who is doing it both, and there are only 3 countries in Europe, England, Sweden, and Holland, who have both tax and ETS systems. Thank you.
Okay. Up next, we have slides.
Yeah, I think we're gonna.
Up next, we have Brendan O'Brien, Waste Equals Food, Integrating Fungi into Organics Recycling in New England. Take it away.
Thanks. So I began my research because I was inspired by the primary role that fungi play as decomposers in the environment, and felt that they had been somewhat underutilized in our systems of waste processing of scale. So in coming to Rubenstein, I was looking for a project that would qualify as what I might describe as an applied mycology project, where I would be able to integrate the role that fungi play as decomposers in the environment into our current waste recycling system. Many of you are familiar with Act 148, Vermont's Universal Recycling and Composting Law. The result of that law is to divert all organic materials away from landfills by 2020. This is a series of measures that has been implemented in phases, beginning in 2012 and culminating in a total food scrap ban from the landfill by 2020. So food scraps are a challenging waste stream to deal with because they are very heterogeneous. So my research focuses on how we might take this gross material that is food waste and turn it back into something that looks like food. Now, current organics recycling strategies primarily consist of composting, and anaerobic digestion. Both of those processes result in byproducts, which are enriched in nutrients and ultimately destined for land application. Many of you are familiar with the water quality issues that we have in Lake Champlain as a result of excess nutrient runoff in the past. So how do we recycle the nutrient value of these materials to grow food, keeping them in the circular nutrient economy on the landscape without applying them to the land itself? So how do we turn food waste back into food and avoid the downstream consequences of declining water quality? This is a schematic of the current organics recycling system in New England that is being integrated with the dairy farm system. It shows primary inputs and outputs. What you'll notice is that feed and bedding material are the primary inputs that go into the husbandry of the cows. The cows produce manure and soiled bedding material, which becomes the primary feedstock for the anaerobic digester. Now, digestion is particularly desirable strategy for treating these materials because we already have the infrastructure in place. There are over 17 digesters on farms in Vermont in operation and 21 around New England. So in the digestion process, that is to create biogas, methane biogas, which is combusted for energy and heat. But again, those byproducts as a result are essentially a sludge that can be separated into solid and liquid fractions with different agronomic value. The liquid portion is most often spread back onto the landscape to fertilize crops and pasture. Some of that material, some of that is harvested as feed and exported off of the farm. But what you'll see is, again, the only real outputs, the only nutrient outputs from the farm system are the milk itself, some feed, and then of course the eutrophication risk downstream as a result of that application of nutrients on the landscape. So, and then I'll also mention that the solids are often recycled as bedding material for the animals themselves. Again, that means they wind up back into the digester, and a lot of that nutrient content winds up back in the liquid material and ultimately applied to the landscape. So if we integrate the organics recycling system with the dairy farm system and bring this large input of nutrients in the form of food waste and food processing residuals onto the farm system, we run the risk of having exacerbated the water quality issue downstream. So there's a potential conflict between organics recycling and water quality objectives. So my proposed solution is the mushroom farm plugin, and that is to divert some of the solids away from bedding and to use them to grow mushrooms for food for people. And that represents another export of nutrients off of the farm landscape that is high value, protein-rich food. We can expect that the amount of these solid materials is likely to increase with the addition of more food waste onto the landscape. And so again, what this represents is a high value reuse of this material. This is the food waste recovery hierarchy, which shows that down here at composting and anaerobic digestion, by using these solids to grow high value food, we wind up right back at the top of the list where we are growing food for people. So again, the goals, the objectives of this research are to reduce the nutrient management uncertainty, to integrate fungi into organics recycling, to minimize environmental harm and the impacts on water quality, and then to also test the value of the residual material itself, the spent mushroom substrate, as a potential compost ingredient or digester feedstock. And then, of course, to produce safe, nutritious, protein-rich food. Thanks.
Brendan. Up next we have Sam Bliss with modified food. Hey.
So is not having enough money to purchase food a good excuse for letting people not be able to access food? Food is a non-substitutable good that people need to survive, and people eat organisms like plants, animals, and fungi. They come from ecosystems. Some of those are agricultural ecosystems or farms, and food production relies on the services of ecosystems, the proper functioning of those ecosystems to create the organisms that we like to eat. foods are, in industrialized countries like ours, almost always commodities, and around the world more and more so. Commodities are fungible with other commodities of the same type. Wheat is wheat is wheat. Organic wheat is organic wheat is organic wheat. Sufficiency wheat is luxury wheat. Markets don't know the difference. And commodities can be traded for money, and more money can buy more commodities or anything else that is a commodity. And that's irrespective of ecological limits. Commodities are allocated to those willing and able to pay the market price. So that means that that is a way for commodities to be allocated to their highest value uses in terms of money. Now, farmers producing commodities get rewarded at the market price. They can't sell for more because there's one market price in a commodity market. So the way that farmers can make more money is by cutting costs. And since ecosystems aren't traded in markets and a lot of their goods and services aren't traded in markets, the best way to cut costs often is to degrade ecosystems that aren't traded in markets. At the same time, because markets allocate food to those willing and able to pay the market price, those that can't afford the market price, like people who are food insecure, who if they could afford the market price would purchase enough food to become food secure, they don't get enough food to be food insecure in the world as it exists. So the global agri-food system that we get from this sort of system uses 40% of the non-ice land in the world, 10% of which is for arable land and the 30% more for livestock production. It produces about 25% of total greenhouse gas emissions, slurps up 2/3 of total freshwater consumption, and is the greatest threat to biodiversity from humans. And of the calories that are produced in crop form that are sufficient to feed more than 10 billion people, 45% are diverted toward either livestock or industrial processes like biofuel manufacturing. And then another 25% of the edible calories are wasted. Of the food that's recoverable, markets distribute it super unequally for the reasons that I explained. So, such that 1/3 of adults in the world are overweight, about a little over 1/10 are obese, and 800 million people are chronically undernourished. They don't get enough to eat. So, most of the academics studying these questions are thinking about how to radically reduce inequality so that everyone has enough money to purchase food, or how to incorporate environmental costs into market prices through either commodifying the environment or creating taxes like the carbon tax that simulate as if the environment were a commodity, such to incorporate the cost to the environment in the prices of goods and services. This incorporating the environmental costs into prices actually exacerbates inequality because it makes food more expensive. And so for people who are already spending 40, 50, 60% of their income on food, that percentage of their income they spend on food goes up, and they have less money left over to spend on all the other things that we need to purchase, like shelter, that are commodities. Also, a lot of the academics who are studying these questions, in trying to devise the perfect policy to deal with the unjust, unsustainable food system and to coerce markets into doing exactly what they don't want to do, which is reaching just and sustainable outcomes, they're ignoring questions of power. Why hasn't economic inequality been radically reduced, even though we know that's the best way to allow people to access basic needs? That's because the rich people don't want to share their wealth with the poor people. Why haven't environmental costs been incorporated into prices, even though we've known for a long time that that's an economically efficient thing to do and the best thing to do for future generations in the environment? Because wealthy corporations, whose entire business plan is to sell cheap food to people and to allow farmers to produce cheap food for people, don't want to incorporate environmental costs into prices. So I'm interested in studying how a non-market food system might work, and I want to use both this theoretical economics study that I've been describing, plus participatory action research with people in industrialized countries where food is mostly a commodity, how they're going about making non-market food systems. Thank you.
next we have Natalie Flores. Cyanobacteria toxins from the water and land to the air.
Thank you. Lakes around the world and other bodies of fresh water are turning green. The cause? Tiny photosynthetic organisms called cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, under certain conditions, can form these dense accumulations and high increases in cells that can sometimes be visible from even space. And these are called blooms. And cyanobacteria blooms are harmful for a number of reasons. But a primary concern is the fact that many types of cyanobacteria can produce toxins. Collectively, these toxins are called cyanotoxins. And they have effects ranging from skin irritation and liver damage to neurological toxicity. The long-term effects of these toxins on people are not known, but people can be exposed to these toxins through a number of direct and indirect exposure routes. The problem with this is that we aren't really sure how people are exposed or the significance of each different exposure route to the total exposure to people. And where my research comes in is that I'm studying two of the lead exposure routes for people, which are contamination of fish that might be consumed by people and inhalation of aerosols. And to do this, I'm using two different components. So to study toxins in fish, I'm looking at it from both a global and a local perspective. So globally, I've collected data from a number of different studies that reported toxin concentrations in both water and fish. And with this data, I would expect to see a positive relationship between the level of toxins in the water and the level found in the fish. Additionally, we can ask other important questions, such as, do toxin concentrations accumulate differently in different tissues, such as liver versus muscle? Or do they accumulate differently in different types of fish, such as omnivorous versus carnivorous? In addition to these questions, we can ask the same type of questions at the local scale, so here in Vermont. And to do this, we've been conducting field studies in a local lake called Shelburne Pond. And that's the one pictured on the right there. We've also collected water and fish samples from Shelburne Pond last year and this year. And additionally, we've collected water and fish samples from Lake Champlain last year. And so we'll be asking these same questions. Is there a positive relationship between toxins in water and fish? And also looking at different tissues and types of fish. To study cyanotoxins in aerosols, we're also conducting a field study, but this will be done next year, also in Shelburne, Vermont. And to do this, we're looking at two sources. We're going to study aerosols both over Shelburne Pond and also at a local farm field in Shelburne. And our hypothesis is that liquid-based fertilizers that are spread across farm fields can potentially promote cyanobacteria growth and can cause aerosols further down the line, either through the spraying of those fertilizers or through dry topsoils that can later be disturbed by wind. And so we're going to test for aerosols both at the source, either Shelburne Pond or the farm field, and different distances away from the source under different environmental conditions, so that we can see if toxins are present in aerosols, and also how those toxins might change over time and space under different environmental conditions. Now, the results from both the global analysis and the field studies are still underway. But what we've seen so far are surprisingly high levels of toxins in Shelburne Pond last summer. And so these toxins are actually both above the World Health Organization's drinking water limit and EPA's proposed recreational limit. So we know that cyanotoxins are present in Vermont, but this just shows that it's important for me to continue researching and others to see how people might be exposed to these different toxins. These results are important. This research is important for both management, because once we know that there's a problem, we can investigate it further and try to figure out if there's how we can better manage the issue. And in conclusion, this research will be important for globally important areas such as resource management, fisheries, and human health. Thank you.